satisfaction with a purely materialist worldview at the moment, and that's such a shift.
You kind of had the genesis of this book in a field in Glastonbury.
If our search for something bigger than us, if we somehow shrink it back down to the size of us, we've totally got it wrong.
There is a control aspect to some of the manifesting and talking about the universe and so on.
It is less vulnerable to manifest to the universe than it is to pray, because there's an impersonal nature to that.
Be wary of the dark side. Rowan Williams recently in an interview expressed his belief in Satan.
The spiritual realm has good and bad. I believe in God and I believe in the devil. This idea that women are looking at witches, the nut success that the film Wicked has had recently, what is it that that's a rejection of?
Is it because we're scared of the language of God that we talk about the universe instead of God? Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting with me, Justin Riley. Special co-presenter today is Graham Tomlin, Bishop Graham Tomlin of Seen and Unseen. Welcome along, Graham.
Great to be here, Justin, and nice to be back on Re-Enchanting again.
Indeed, it's been a little while, but our very special guest, quite unusually turning up to Re-Enchanting for possibly only the 90th time, is in fact Belle Tindall-Riley. Belle, welcome to the show. I don't know if you've ever been here before, but
No,
it's lovely to have you on.
Tell me, what's the premise? What is this re-enchanting weird you're talking about?
I know. Well, let me tell you about this crazy show I've been involved in. Lovely, Belle. We'd make a joke of it, but you are the special guest on Re-Enchanting today because you've written a book, and it's basically re-enchanting in book form. I'm just going to say it. It's re-enchanting in book form, and it's a wonderful book that I've really enjoyed reading it. So
it is a very, very good book. I was telling Belle yesterday how much I really enjoyed reading it over the weekend, and so I'm a fan already. I think it's just really well written. I think it's a fascinating thesis. So you know, if you're listening to this, you know, I mean, you can pause the recording at this moment to go out and buy it or whatever it is, or do it at the end of the recording. But it really is very good.
The Sacred Ache is the name of the book, and I know you've been working on this for the last couple of years, Belle.
Yeah.
Before we jump into it, before we obviously have our signature question, you know, can't forget that on Re-Enchanting.
Yes.
Just for the benefit of those who may not, you know, have listened to you for the last 9 seasons or so, a little bit of your background, because you are not just Belle Tindall-Riley, you are Dr. Belle Tindall-Riley. I am. At some point, you spent a lot of time looking at one very specific thing in order to become a doctor, didn't you? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's absolutely true. I spent 4 years or so, maybe a little longer than that, in an absolute academic bubble, like as hidden as anyone could be, in utter obscurity in rural West Wales. Doing a doctorate, so I have a doctorate in biblical studies, more specifically the Gospel of John, more specifically than that, the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John, which some people think that that's wild, that I would spend 4 years just really drilling into sort of one scene in one book of the Bible, but honestly, I needed like another 4 straight after. It just wasn't enough to even scratch the surface. So yeah, that's me. I do actually have, maybe I bring it up every now and again, particularly when we're talking to NT Wright. I just can't help it myself.
The New Testament credentials come out when you're in that kind of company.
I can't. He's like my Beyonce. I can't help but kind of go full Bible geek in his presence.
You don't have posters on your wall, do you?
That would be a step too far. No.
I'm glad to hear it.
I don't think he's just got a pin up of NT Wright on the bedroom wall.
Does such thing exist? If it does,
there's probably a market out there for it, frankly.
I'm sure there is.
But obviously, you've spent the last 3 to 4 years actually more in journalistic mode, and that takes you everywhere and talking about everything, doesn't it? So, was it a kind of a weird transition going from like nailing down on one particular chapter in a few verses of John's Gospel to like, oh, let's just talk about everything that exists now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, it was also a massive relief as well. It was like, oh yeah, there is a world outside my window. Let's talk about that. Yeah, absolutely. And as I don't know, I make no secret of this. And specifically, if you read the book, I really make no secret of this. But when I was in my kind of academic bubble, I really thought anything that I ever say or write or think will be for Christians and Christians only, because I'm terrible, have been terrible at speaking about my faith, about my spiritual tradition to those who aren't within it. So that's really hilarious when you think about what I do now, when we think about re-enchanting, when we think about everything I've written for Seen and Unseen and other places. When I think about this book, so I think that's been the biggest transition is changing my conversation partner, really, has been vulnerable and terrifying, but also quite weirdly intoxicating. I absolutely love it now. And I'm still as terrified as ever, but so I think that's been the major shift, really, is that outward lookingness.
And did you have to find a new voice as well? Because I guess when you're writing academic papers and books, and I know a little bit about that, you have to write in a particular way. You have to make sure all possible arguments against your thesis are kind of warded off to begin with. Yes. So, you really got a perfect piece, and you can't do that in journalistic writing. And, you've written a chapter for a book that I've edited, which is coming out, which is much more academic. This is kind of more on the Seen and Unseen, kind of popular journalistic style, appealing to a wider audience. Did you have to find a new voice, do you think, when you started writing in this different way? And how did you do that?
Yeah, gosh, yes. The short answer is yes. You're right. When you're writing academically, you really want something to be bulletproof before you're willing to put it out into the world, just absolutely watertight. And you are kind of preempting anyone disagreeing with you and then writing your defense into your offense so that it's all like, come at me. I have every angle covered here, and only then will I put it in the world. And you're absolutely right. I think writing the types of things I've been writing for the past 3 years, that is not an option. I have to put something out and be aware that it's not bulletproof, that it's not watertight, that it invites discussion, that it's not designed to be the final word on something, but in many cases, it's designed to be the first word on something and the beginning of a conversation, not the shutdown of it. That is all brand new skill for me. And also, that idea of finding my voice, because again, I think in much academic writing, you're taught to hide your voice in a way. It's not completely impersonal, an academic piece of writing, but they don't want a huge amount of you in there because you're really the least important part of anything you're submitting. And so in this book, and actually in many of the pieces I've written, in many of the Re-Enchanting episodes, actually, I've actively decided to put quite a lot of myself in these things. In hopefully quite a vulnerable kind of way. So that absolutely finding my own voice and being okay with it being quite overtly out there is quite.
So I guess with academic writing, you're supposed to be objective. You're supposed to be kind of, just take yourself out of it, your own personal subjectivity, and praise something that's logically watertight and out there. Whereas I guess what you're writing is something much more intuitive and personal and subjective, which is a kind of different way of doing things, different way of knowing things, different way of sort of learning and presenting yourself in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I think I say maybe in every article I ever write, certainly in every chapter of this book, I'll say things like, I have a hunch, my inkling is, I get the sense that, I feel, and that, I mean, if I sent this book back to my PhD supervisor, my gosh, she'd be like, what are you doing? So you're right, it's a totally different way of writing. And
is it vulnerable. A bit more because you talk about your love of Ian McGilchrist in the book, The Sacred Ache. Is it a little bit more right-brained, a bit more intuitional, not so much the rationalistic left-brained defence? That was yours? That's a lovely way to put it, Justin. And that's my defence always, is listen, put the left brain down for a second. Meet me here. Yeah, I try. In a way, that leads us nicely into the signature question, which all the listeners and viewers have been waiting with bated breath for, because we obviously always, you and I, ask every single episode of this show, what our guest has been reading recently. So so tell us, Belle, what's been on your nightstand? And I'd love to hear sort of what, when you've had to then write a book, how much of all of that reading, because I've always felt whenever we've asked our guests this question over the years, Belle, you are much more likely to have actually heard of or read the books than I ever am. So I just know you're massively more well-read than I ever am. So, but that must bring an extra pressure when you finally come to write your own book. Sort of thing. Hey, what are you reading at the moment? And tell us, how all that reading has fed into your own book.
Yeah, well, as is tradition on this show and in my own life, I do not have one answer. I have two answers for you.
Good.
Do you think, Justin, anyone has come to this question and been like, this is the one book? Done.
I can't recall a single episode where there was only one book mentioned.
Yeah,
it's true.
I don't think that's happened. So in tradition, I'm reading two things. I'm reading Paul Kingsnorth's Against the Machine, and I'm finally reading that. That has been on my bedside table for months, and I just haven't quite waked up the bravery to read it until now. I think because I knew it was going to be, Ian McGilchrist writes on the back, it is a chilling read. It's one of those books that I knew once I read it, I can't unread it. And Paul has quite an urgent message that he gives, and he worries about the world, basically. And so you're entering into that worry when you read this book, but it's the most wonderful book. He's the most phenomenal writer. So I'm reading that. And then maybe as somewhat of an antidote to that, I'm also reading Liza Minnelli's autobiography.
Oh, well, Liza Minnelli and Paul Kingsnorth, natural bedfellows. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I quite like it because I feel like those two together do sort of sum up my personality a little bit. So it's called Kids Wait Till You Hear This, and it's as you can imagine, she's Liza Minnelli, like she's had the most bizarre life, obviously the daughter of Judy Garland, and so it's a look at her life, quite an unflinching look at her life, but also it's a kind of a glimpse into a world that doesn't really exist anymore, and sort of this old Hollywood, and you find yourself being both kind of sad and nostalgic for this world that doesn't exist, but also utterly relieved that this world doesn't exist anymore. So those are the two things I'm reading at the moment. And like I say, if those two together don't sum up my personality, I don't really know what does. We've got the high and the low in there, the highbrow and the lowbrow.
And what about the way that all that reading, do you feel the pressure when you come to write your own book? Because like Graham, I sense a really a personal conversational tone to the way you write. And I wonder if that's just you, maybe that's just, you can't write any other way. I don't know. What would you say?
Do you know what? I think that has become me. I think, as Graham mentioned, I tried to write an academic chapter for a book that he is releasing, and I did do it, but I definitely found that now is the foreign language to me. That now took far more work. I think I can't help but write as I speak. Now that's sort of what I've learnt to do, and it's very much conversational. I can't really write in any other way than as if the person I'm writing for is sat before me and we're having a coffee. That's just the only way I really feel comfortable telling anyone what I think or what I think they should think. I can't do that in a non-personable way anymore.
It did make me feel like I was kind of having just like a really lengthy version of Re-Enchanting with you, where we were just getting down to chat, and that was really nice. It was like, this just feels really familiar. Like I'm just chatting away with Belle while reading this book. It's really nice.
And you are very you're very open about yourself in the book. In fact, there's a section, I think, in the very first, I don't know if it's the introduction or the introduction, where you kind of almost lay out yourself and say, look, I want to tell you about who I am. And you say, I did a doctorate in biblical studies. I'm Gen Z, geriatric Gen Z.
Yeah. Elizabeth Oldfield called me that. So thank you, Elizabeth Oldfield.
So that's where it came from. Yeah. So, I'm not very brave. I did my cycling proficiency course without riding a bike. I'm Welsh, etc. So we kind of get to know you on almost the very first pages. So as we go into it, which again is so opposite to the kind of academic mode of writing, where you really do have to hide any sort of subjectivity, any personality. And I suppose what struck me about it was that, that personal nature, as Justin was saying, it's like having a conversation with you, as opposed to presenting some sort of objective, kind of logical, rational case for Christianity. It's more of a kind of, there's a definite, like a sort of I mean, whether it's as carefully thought out as this, but the sort of seems to me that the kind of approach of the book is actually precisely presenting Christian faith through the lens of yourself, a person, a real live flesh and blood person. And I tend to think is more powerful for the result of that. But was that a conscious thing for you to do that? That there's something, when I've heard you sometimes talk about, an embodied kind of witness, that witness has to be somehow filtered through yourself, your personality, and that a kind of disembodied witness doesn't really work very well. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think right from the beginning, right when I was just toying with this idea of a book, as I was wandering through Glastonbury Music Festival, maybe we'll talk about that in a bit. Even right there in the beginnings, I think what I wanted this book to do, its aims really, was to sort of change the structures of plausibility, I think, when it comes to Christianity. And what I mean by that is I do think things have shifted now, but certainly when I was a child, teenager, in my early 20s, it was stony ground. Being a Christian was the weirdest, most obscure and nonsensical thing you could possibly be. Nothing about the way I lived my life made sense to the people who didn't live it that way. And so I think what I really wanted to do was take a certain group of people, this group of people that would call themselves spiritual but not religious and are actively engaging in spiritual practices that aren't attached to a specific religion. And I wanted to change the structure of plausibility for those people. And I think the best way to do that is to kind of put yourself on the table, make yourself a case study, really. And so that these people reading this book, hopefully, because I've tried to be as honest as possible and it was quite uncomfortable at times. And you're right, at the beginning, I think I'm really open and in that I say, listen, you're about to have my voice in your head for the next however many days, weeks, months, years, And so I think it's only right that you know what voice you're inviting into the deepest parts of you. Because I speak to some deep parts of my readers, like their longings and their greatest fears and their existential neediness. Like I touch on it all, and I just felt like I needed to earn that right, really, by being as vulnerable myself as I was hoping they would be as my conversation partner. But you're right. I think this whole book really is just an invitation to come and see. I think that's the language I've been using. And I steal that from John 4. So it's pulling my past life into my present one. It's because what I do is I say, I have every longing that you have. I have every desire that you have, every craving, every fear that you have. Like, I believe we were designed with them. So I'm not immune to them, nor is any other Christian who exists, past, present, future. So come and see where I go with those longings, with those cravings, with those fears. And then that's just like an opportunity again and again and again and again, in as embodied a way as possible, to point to myself in order to point through myself, to ultimately to Jesus and to the story that I breathe in and out. It was both intentional right from the start, but also just really developed and became a non-negotiable for me as I was writing this book.
Yeah, it really reminds me, Belle, of something. It wouldn't be me on Re-Enchanting without mentioning Pascal, but one of the things Pascal says is this, it is the heart that knows God, not the reason. And that's not because he doesn't believe in reason, but he believes that actually the way we access God, which is a different kind of being than the other things we access within the world, is through some deep personal instinct about sort of faith. That's where faith comes from, which is why I think when we're talking about God, actually the kind of approach you've taken, which is a much more subjective, personal, embodied approach, actually is kind of appropriate to the object of what you're trying to talk about, because you're talking about God. You're not talking about physics. You're not talking about mathematics or engineering. You're talking about God, and you can only do that in a personal way, not an objective way. So I think it works. I think it works really, really well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's that. What does Pascal says? The heart is reasons that reason knows nothing of.
Exactly.
Is that? Yep. Yeah, it's one of the best phrases.
That could embody, re-enchanting as well, couldn't it? It's all about that search for the transcendent beyond just reason. But
yes,
you kind of had the genesis, I think, for this book, the idea in a field in Glastonbury about 2 years ago. Belle, tell us about the healing field and how that made you think about this sacred ache, as you call it.
Yes, yeah. All the best ideas, I think, happen in a field somewhere, don't they? Yeah. So the book began and begins, because it's the first page. It's how I opened the book, at Glastonbury Music Festival. So I went for the first time in 2024, and I have become a cliche because I do mention it an inappropriate amount, but there we go. Yeah, and I mean, the whole thing took me by surprise, really. The whole thing was definitely deeper, more full of meaning, more achy, if I'm to use my own phrase, than I was expecting it to be. People really just pausing the rhythm of their lives to go in search of awe and wonder and transcendence and escape in many ways. And so all of it took me by surprise, really. But you're right, there's this one section of the site which is affectionately called the healing field. It's really large, it's really big. This isn't a small section of the festival. And I wandered through that field, and every spiritual experience, spiritual practice that you could possibly imagine is on offer in that field. Like stalls and tents that just offer everything and anything that you would call experiential or mystical or spiritual. Like, it's there for people. And that field is rammed. It is so full. It's so busy. And when you're reminding yourself that, like, Shania Twain is playing on the Pyramid stage, and yet this field is teeming with people, I was just so struck by it. Struck by the fact that I couldn't get anywhere near most of the tents. I couldn't get anywhere near most of the stalls. Like, there were queues and people just willing to wait there for hours. And that's really, you're right, that's really where this book was born, because I looked at these people, and I think I grew up in a Christian household, in a Christian context, and we've always been incredibly nervous of any kind of spirituality that sort of we can't comfortably stamp the word Christian on. Excuse me. And I understand that. And we can talk about that maybe. I understand that, and I don't think that's wholly wrong. But I was looking at these people and I was like, I just feel like it would be inappropriate to dismiss you in this moment, or to roll my eyes at the longings that have brought you here. Like, I believe we are spiritual beings living in a spiritual world created by a God for him. To borrow a quote by St. Augustine, where he says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." And so I just, in that moment, started to look around that field and just be like, there's a lot of restlessness here.
It reminds me a bit of, Paul in Athens in Acts 17, walking through the city, so many idols to foreign gods. And, as a devout Jew, they kind of offended him at one level. But when he actually goes and speaks to the Stoics and philosophers, he says, "I see you're very religious in every way." He doesn't sort of say, how terrible, he doesn't rail against them in that way.
Absolutely. I think you would have to stand in Glastonbury for like 30 seconds before you could confidently scream, like, "People of Glastonbury, I can see that in every way you're a religious bunch." Like, it's just so obvious to me. Yeah.
And I can remember talking to you, Belle, just I think after you came back from that Glastonbury visit, and you were telling me a little bit about this, the healing field or whatever it was called. But I think you also said, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a kind of Christian bit of the Glastonbury, which was in a different field. And there was a kind of tent or something, but there weren't that many queues going to that bit. And somehow it sort of felt a very different thing. That I remember you were reflecting on how Christian faith felt like something so sort of different, alien, not really answering the yearnings of this group of people. And you kind of wonder, maybe there should have been a Christian tent in the field there. Maybe that's a little bit closer to what Paul would have had, because he was in a context where Christian faith was one of many different spiritual practices in the world, and he had to, to kind of promote it, to kind of make a case for it, to kind of put it forward within the context of a whole range of other options, rather than some sort of specialist field over there in the corner. Was that right? Am I recollecting that right?
You are recollecting that right, yeah. And I should say up front that I do not know who runs the church in Glastonbury Festival or how they decided to be where they are. It may be that they asked to be in the healing field and weren't allowed. So I just want to put that caveat out there. But yes, you're right. The church, which is in a marquee on the other side of the festival, up a hill, really hard to get to. as far as I can tell, is not drawing the same crowds. And you're right. I remember coming home and being like, the church should be in the middle of the healing field, right there in the middle of the healing field, you know, and I was quite like stubborn about it. And in a way, I still am. You're absolutely right. I think, I mean, this is why I wrote the book, right? Because people were going to the healing fields and they weren't traipsing up the hill to go to the church. And so somewhere along the way, Christianity has stopped being seen as something that can satisfy their most sort of mystical, spiritual longings. It's stopped being seen as a religion that's in any way experiential or in any way can meet them where they're at. And I lament that because as a Christian, I just know that that's so far from the truth. And so, yeah, you're right. In a way, this book is me putting the church in the healing field and kind of, for better or for worse, just starting a conversation in that way. Because, yeah, I think that's where we need to be, or some of us at least.
Yeah. And you'd probably find manifestations in that healing field of all of the 7 different areas of spirituality that you cover in this book.
Yeah.
I mean, just to take us through them, you talk about the modern interest in the quote unquote the universe as a sort of placeholder almost for God in a lot of people's minds. You talk about, you know, Reiki and healing, that kind of thing, manifesting as well, witchcraft, the psychics, intuition, tarot, meditation, astrology and crystals, nature worship. So huge range of things. And there's more that you could have included, I'm sure, even beyond just those things. I mean, the one that I thought you probably would have loved to include, but probably just didn't have space for in this book, is psychedelics as well. You know, there's a huge kind of, you know, interest and area in that. But I mean, it was fascinating you start with the universe, because as I say, this pops up a lot, doesn't it? You know, and you kind of sheepishly admit to watching Love Island occasionally in the book, Val. But it's obviously purely for research purposes, and this was and just the fact that phrases like, oh, the universe, you know, saw that coming, or the universe told me to do that, or whatever. Yeah, talk about sort of how you've seen in popular culture this way in which people talk about some kind of ultimate transcendent, but they've kind of almost, is it because we're scared of the language of God that we talk about the universe instead of God?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. You're right. Like, people thank the universe, pray to the universe, kind of console themselves with the fact that the universe has got them. I call it the capital U universe, because of course the lowercase u universe exists and is a wholly different thing. And I kind of tease that out. But there's just this dissatisfaction, I think. And Justin, you've spoken about this so much. There's this dissatisfaction with a purely materialist worldview at the moment. I'm really sensing that. And that's such a shift. And I don't want to like over explain that. It's just something I'm noticing. There's just dissatisfaction with, you know, what we constantly call a disenchanted world. Like Charles Taylor, he talks about the immanent frame, doesn't he? This idea that all that we see is all that there is. Like, the world's got a lid on it. And that's all that there is. And I've been seeing that recede, kind of losing ground recently. But there's one thing being disenchanted with disenchantment, right? There's one thing wanting there to be more to reality than what our 5 senses can tell us. There's one thing kind of not finding the Richard Dawkins atheism attractive anymore. It's a whole other thing, signing up wholesale to a religious tradition. And so there is this interesting middle ground where people will talk about, Fern Cotton, the broadcaster turned sort of like wellness guru. I bring her book up a lot because it's fascinating. She just talks about the bigger than me, bigger than me. Like, the universe is probably the most common one, or just energy. People talk about energy or the divine or the transcendent, or the source is quite a common one as well. Because there is this reluctance to kind of put a story around this higher power, or to put kind of a framework around it. And I understand that, because if you keep it mysterious and if you keep it ambiguous, there's almost like a guardedness in that. There's like a safety in that. There's like it's not that vulnerable to do that, because you think, well, we can't know anything about this higher power anyway. And
is it also that kind of language gives us a certain degree of control over it because it's so inspecific, it's so impersonal, it's so slightly vague. We can sort of keep it at, we can do it on our terms, if you like. We can kind of access these spiritual moments and, sort of feelings in a field in Glastonbury, but it doesn't really make too many demands upon us, and that's quite comforting in a kind of way. And I guess the other thing that interests me about that whole move is the idea of the universe or the bigger than us or whatever it might be. It's all kind of, it's like impersonal. It's not a person. Whereas I guess when Christians talk about God, we talk about God in personal terms, both the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and so on. And so that seems to be something that's going on there. Whereas I guess what you're talking about is engaging with that beyond spiritual transcendent reality. But that reality has a face, has a name, as opposed to just a rather kind of vague thing that we can somehow control in some way. Is that right? That it's part about us keeping in control of it, having it on our terms?
I think there's certainly an element of it because, yes, spiritual openness seems to be on the rise, but that doesn't mean that other things that are so baked into us have left us. So things like individualism, things like consumerism, those are still deeply, deeply laced within who we are. And so it's pretty inevitable that those things will be baked into any type of spirituality that we find ourselves seeking out. And so, you're right, there's an element where we still want to be able to control things. We still want it to be just between us and the universe without any demands of any kind of community lodged onto us. And also, and I say this again and again and again in the book, it is less vulnerable to manifest to the universe, for example, to work within the laws of attraction, to manifest your dreams, than it is to pray. Because you're right, because there's an impersonal nature to that. Whereas if what you're saying is, I believe that there is a God and that God is sentient and has wills and thoughts and might say yes to some things and no to others, that's really vulnerable. And that requires an extra element of wrestling, I think. And that requires us to really put ourselves out there, I think, in a way that kind of abstract spirituality doesn't. And I remember we did an episode of Re-Enchanting with Ashley Landy. And again, Justin, you mentioned psychedelics. I think I could do a whole second book just on that, but people like Ashley have done it better, so I won't. And I remember asking her, don't you find Christianity quite claustrophobic? Because, when you're used to saying things like all is all and there is no limit to anything and we can't know anything and the universe is huge and we just don't know, to then come to an actual religious story and tie yourself to it, I was like, don't you find that claustrophobic? And it's because I'd just written this book and I was genuinely wondering, and I asked the same of Nick Mulvey, and they were like, no, the confines are a relief. The boundaries are a relief. There's rest in the fact that I know who I'm talking to and it's not just this all is all, we can't know anything personally. So I think that was really interesting for me.
I wanted to chime in as well on what Graham was saying there, and you picked up, Belle, that there is a kind of almost control aspect to some of this manifesting and talking about the universe and so on. And it is quite consumeristic in that sense. It's about what can it do for me, and so on. But then again, even with prayer, sometimes in some Christian traditions, it shouldn't be treated that way. But it can be. We can sometimes approach prayer as a kind of, if I do this and say the right words, then I can control the outcomes, and God sort of has to do what I say. If I, so it's easy it's easy to see why people stumble into this idea that this is what it means to communicate with God, that it's some kind of control mechanism, right? So how do you kind of contrast prayer with this kind of manifesting and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the joy of writing this book. I've been a Christian my whole life, and so things that I've just taken for granted, all of a sudden I have to communicate, in this really sort of freeing back to basics way. And so I've really had to think, okay, what is the difference between manifesting and prayer? Other than the fact that manifesting, what I say in the book is manifesting is this culmination of these two deep desires we have. A, to be in control of our own circumstances, and B, desperately to not be in control of our own circumstances. And manifesting meets us at the perfect intersection of those two deep, deep desires. And so prayer then, what I say is, I mean, it's kind of like, in a way goes without saying, but prayer is relationship. There's nothing in the practice of manifesting your dreams that is about building a relationship between you and whatever you think is on the other side of your manifestation, right? Between you and let's keep calling it the universe or the source. There's nothing about building a trust or a reliance or feeling loved or held or cared for. There's nothing about learning the character or the nature of the universe or feeling like your character and nature are understood and cherished. Like, there's no relationship building there. It's not centered on this deep personal love in that way. And of course, prayer is. So we pray, and I say, like, I'm really open in the book. I'm like, listen, I pray, and sometimes God says yes to the things I ask him for, and sometimes he says no. Sometimes that's a not now, sometimes that's a not never, that's a not ever. And so there's this deep vulnerability in there. But I say, like, but never, ever, ever have I come out of a no assuming that it's because I'm not worthy of a yes, or because I didn't pray hard enough, or I got the formula wrong, or just the love wasn't there, or, you know, that it was somehow my fault or anything like that. It's vulnerable because you're coming to a someone, not a something. It's deeply rooted in relationship. And if relationship is stripped out, it's not really prayer. So that's how I've kind of teased it out, I think.
I mean, what's fascinating to me is that, you know, you go on to obviously talk about a number of other really interesting things that are popping up increasingly in social media circles and elsewhere. This sacred ache coming out in things like witchcraft. So tell us a little bit about kind of what you've noticed happening in those spaces. And it's another, in many ways, I think, another kind of way of trying to control nature and your circumstances and that kind of thing, isn't it? But perhaps in a, you know, maybe keying into sort of, I guess, more arguably pagan practices and things like that. And again, where for you what's this telling us about the ache that's behind that activity?
So yes, the chapter on witchcraft, I call it the female Roman Empire, which is because I eavesdropped on a conversation between two young women when I was at the cinema, and as they were walking out of the cinema, they just said, I think part of being a woman is that you think about witches at least once a day. And this other one was like, absolutely, I think about them all the time. Like, I just think it's part of who we are, is to relate to witches. And then the other lady said, yeah, and part of being a man is being scared of witches. You know, like, there was like this deep. And so that's really where that chapter started for me. And what I specifically write about is witches, the term witch, as some kind of spiritual feminist identity. That's really what I hone in on there. Because yes, witchcraft is commonly associated with religious labels such as Wicca and paganism, druids, things like that. That has always been the case, is still the case, is increasingly the case. But what I've found fascinating is this idea that women are looking at witches, be they fictional, you know, thinking about the nuts success that the film Wicked has had recently, or actually a renewed fascination with the witch hunts of the 17th century, or, you know, there's just this growing fascination. Witch talk is a thing now. Romantasy, so that's fantasy romance, is one of the top categories in literature at the moment. It's just everywhere, and it's being driven by women. And so what I really tried to dig into is like why? What is it that that's a rejection of, and what is it that that's a real adopting of? And so I really dig into that. And again, I dig into this idea that women, and I don't, like, quite rightly in some cases with all good reason, think of Christianity as something that's not for them because they are women. And so they have this spiritual angst. They want some kind of spiritual dimension to their life. And Christianity, they just rule it out offhand because it's a quote unquote man's religion. And so that's why, you know, that's why witchcraft is so much more appealing. And I totally understand that. I understand that. But I, as a Christian, don't think about witches so much. So I was like, well, maybe it's that. It's this sense of, I, as a woman, want to be celebrated for who I am as a woman. I don't want my characteristics to be villainized. I want to feel connected to my body and to the earth in a way that feels more, quote unquote, feminine, whatever that means to people. And they just don't find that in Christianity. And so I just do my darndest to sort of explain, again, really vulnerably, I hope, I fear, why I, as a woman, am stubbornly also Christian and refuse to not be.
Do you, I mean, it's a really fascinating chapter, the one on paganism. But I guess that raised a question for me, which I guess many of the other chapters did as well, as to whether we are seeing a kind of re-paganizing of our culture. It's something that a number of sort of figures in public life have mused on recently. I think Louise Perry wrote about it. Are we seeing a re-paganizing of society? Naomi Wolf did something similar. You see it coming up in a number of different places. And I've always had this sort of sense that there are really only two deep religious traditions in Europe. One is Christianity, the other is paganism. Yes, the others have come and gone a little bit. You've got Islam had a sort of presence in Spain in the kind of Middle Ages, but it's relatively short term compared to the sort of deep roots of paganism and Christianity. And then there's an argument that paganism never quite went away, even during the years of Christendom. All those sort of practices under the surface were all bubbling away, never quite sort of disappeared. Do you subscribe to that thesis? Are we seeing a kind of re-paganism as Christianity retreats? The only alternative really is paganism to come back into the world. Are we back to where the early church was as one option within a kind of broad pantheon of different gods, or are we seeing something different going on here? I'm just interested, especially with your background in New Testament studies and having studied a little bit about the context of Jesus. How do you read that narrative?
It's a great question. The headline would be that I think I agree with the likes of Louise Perry, who talks about the repaganization of our society. This idea that we're so post-Christian, we're almost pre-Christian again, like we're coming full circle. And isn't that just the story of human history in general? Yes. So I would say, as you say, as a New Testament person, I think we are getting a bit first century again. I do. I think for the past few decades, we've been looking for one dominant story. And one dominant story has kind of ruled the roost at any given time. You could argue that for a while that was Christianity. You can argue that for the past few decades, that's been new atheism, materialism, all of that kind of thing. And I wonder now if we're like, okay, well, what's the next big story going to be? What's the next dominant story about to be? And I wonder, and this is really me just in the realm of hunches and speculation, I wonder if, because we're kind of in this kind of democratized, everything decentralized, sort of everyone in their own silos a little bit, I wonder actually if that's not quite going to be the case, if what we're going to see is a smorgasbord of spiritual options and everybody kind of picking and choosing and piecing things together. I think it was Andrew Ollerton who says, like, if the country of Venezuela was one day sort of obliterated for whatever reason, what you wouldn't get is every Venezuelan person migrating to one country. You'd get them dispersing in all kinds of directions. And so I think if new atheism, secularism, all of that is being obliterated, at least in certain pockets of the cultural landscape, what we're not going to see is everyone flock in one direction. What we're going to see is them dispersed to lots of different options. That's certainly what I'm seeing. And so all of that to say that, yes, I think that is what's happening. And I also think that when it comes specifically to people sort of wanting to, and like, I want to caveat this. It's not that everyone is like going full fat pagan. I don't think that, I mean, the numbers are rising, but they're still relatively small, right? They're relatively small. But what we are seeing is people just wanting little bits of it, little crumbs of it.
Yeah, and maybe what we're seeing is a kind of repaganizing, but a sort of being filtered through a much more modern sensibility, which is both consumerist and individualist. So it's not, I want to join a cult. of worshippers of this particular god, but I want my own distinct version of it. And also that's being delivered on a plate for me by the algorithm of social media, which will kind of commercialize and commoditize certain practices like the ones you write about in your book, and that present it to us so we can just pick it off the shelf and use it.
For me, it's like going for nature worship in the woods, but going for a Starbucks afterwards, because you want your latte alongside your. I mean, thinking of that, one person who features quite prominently in the book is, of course, Paul Kingsnorth, and I love the fact that Paul both endorses the book and is a significant character in the book, and is kind of one of the very first people we spoke to actually here on Re-Enchanting, and kind of really defined to some extent. I think his story itself defines that ache, that sacred ache. That comes through so clearly, doesn't it, in his own story? Tell us about that, because in a way, he did that pagan journey, himself in one way or another, and people can go back to season 1 to hear the full story. But tell us, Belle, sort of how his story kind of resonated through what you were writing as well.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I should say up front that this book wouldn't exist if Re-Enchanting didn't. I think I say that in the acknowledgements. Like, I quote Martin Shaw, I quote Kate Bowler. You're right. Paul Kingsnorth is like basically the linchpin of one of my chapters. So this book wouldn't exist without the many, many conversations we've had with the most phenomenal people, just reminding me again and again in their own ways that we are desperate to take the lid off our disenchanted world. So yes, Paul Kingsnorth, he, you can go and listen to his story because he'll tell it so much better than I can. I believe he was in season 1. But he was pretty I think he would call it maybe agnostic, because he always thought there was something sacred about the world, but definitely didn't massively subscribe to any kind of religion or worldview that had like a god at the centre. But he sort of dabbled in Zen Buddhism a little bit. Then he found himself kind of wanting to worship something, and Buddhism doesn't really give you that option. So he kind of stopped off at Wicca for a while. And then very reluctantly, and he reminds me of C.S. Lewis in this way, very reluctantly found himself a Christian. And I think his precise words to us, Justin, were, maybe I'm a Christian. Damn it. Damn it. Like a real sort of like...
The most reluctant convert, yes.
Exactly. He could rival C.S. Lewis in that way, couldn't he? But I put his story in the book in quite big chunks, really, because... You're right. I think he epitomizes exactly what we're talking about, which is we're seeing kind of the state of things and we're dissatisfied with them. We're dissatisfied with the way our world feels and looks and sounds and is. And so what we start thinking maybe is like a political issue, we quickly realize it's deeper than that. And then what we think maybe is kind of like a social issue, we think, it kind of is, but it's deeper than that. And we go further and further and further, and our dissatisfaction just like stubbornly stays and stays and stays and stays, until all of a sudden in our own ways we think maybe this is a spiritual thing. Maybe all of this is a spiritual thing. Maybe what I want is to find spiritual answers to spiritual questions. Maybe these longings I have are spiritual. And I think that's where many people are finding themselves. I think that's where Paul found himself. That's why he decided he needed a spiritual path to kind of weave him through some of the things that were scaring him about the world. He needed a spiritual path to help him, to kind of guide him through the landscapes of everything he was thinking and feeling. And I don't think that's a rare story, personally. I'm seeing that again and again, that people think these old things, these old stories, these old myths, these old traditions, these old religions. I think that's where I want to be. That's where I want to find myself. That's what I want to glean from. And so while Paul has found himself a Christian, an Orthodox Christian, so he's gone, full fat with it. I see people like at every step of his journey, really, in every sort of inch of what he told us. And so that's why I put it in there. He's specifically in the chapter on nature worship, because I think climate anxiety is a huge reason why we're talking about what we're talking about. This idea that we're looking at ourselves and each other and are kind of like, what are we doing and why can't we stop doing what we're doing? As Paul Kingsnorth says, we're becoming a machine in a way. And with AI and sort of immortality technology and all of these things, that's only increasing, and that's only making us more nervous. It's interesting, isn't it? We might think that all of that would make us feel peaceful, like progress equals peace, and somehow it's making us feel the opposite. And so we're going back to old things, and old things tend to be, for better or for worse, spiritual things, mystical things, weird things.
That story of Paul Kingsnorth, I guess, reminds me of another story of someone else who found their way into full-fat Christian orthodoxy, orthodox with a big O. He's Rod Dreher, who's I know, kind of American columnist, wrote a book which I was thinking about when I was reading yours. It's called Living in Wonder. And he writes in a similar way about a sort of journey of finding a kind of much more sort of supernatural, kind of visceral kind of Christian faith and the kind of rather bland forms he grew up with. But I said one theme he focused on in that book, which I wanted to ask you about, Belle, was, and which is related to the point about paganism in the past, is that he has a chapter where he talks about how, be wary of the dark side, he calls it.
Yeah.
And that the early Christians, when they looked at the paganism around them, they saw not just a sort of neutral set of practices, but they saw something kind of dark and mysterious and quite destructive at work. And I guess that the whole realm of, in the whole realm of spirituality, Christians believe there is good and there is evil within that as well. There are dark powers at work. And, Rowan Williams recently in a interview expressed his belief in, Satan,
Saint
evil
Rowan.
is a thing. And I wonder how you sort of factored that into this discussion, and to what extent you feel, are there evil powers at work in this? How do you kind of deal with that question? How the early Christians would have talked about a kind of repaganizing, that's my question, I guess. And I was just intrigued to see how you would speak about that side of the spiritual realities that people are accessing right now.
It's a good question, and the headline would be that I do it subtly.
You do.
Probably too gently. I'm expecting that to be one of the major criticisms that come back at me, specifically from Christians, is that I'm too gentle with that. And I think there's only one place in the whole book where I say, do not touch this. And that's with psychic mediumship. So specifically communicating with the dead. That's a chapter I sort of refused to write in a way, both because I was like, I can't write something about something as painful as death in a way that's purely academic and hypothetical and theological. But if I was to do, when for so many people it is not hypothetical, academic or theological, it is personal and it's painful. So I kind of refused to do that. But also because I say in the book, to be honest, if I was to write this chapter, I would tell you not to go anywhere near this, not to touch it with a barge pole, because we are dealing with something that we might want deeply, but we do not understand. And so that's the only place in the book where I say, don't touch it. In the rest of the book, I try to, again, we'll keep coming back to it. And apologies for being so kind of like biblical in my outlook, but I'm a New Testament nerd. I can't escape it. Again, my guiding principle there was Paul in Athens, that Justin mentioned right at the top of the conversation, where he rocks up in Athens and we're actively told he was distressed by all of the places that people's sacred aches were taking them. So there is a distress within me. I can't deny that. There's a distress. Yet I was so taken by the fact that when he gets up and stands up to give this major speech in front of the culture-making council of the day, that distress actually doesn't lead the way. He's quite relaxed, and actually he has this generous curiosity about him. And I tried to take that. And so if anyone was to ever probe me on it, I would be very honest about my distress. But I actively decided to not go heavy with it on the book, because what I wanted to do with the book is have a posture of curiosity and to really dig for the longings that I don't think are wrong, even if I am distressed about where they're going. So that's the first thing to say. Having said all of that, so I've just written a piece about Rowan Williams talking about evil spirits, because I love Rowan Williams. And so he is challenging me, and others are challenging me, that if I'm going to be so overt with one side of the spiritual coin, I have to be as overt with the other. And so although that's not what this book in particular is written for or aims to do, that's something I am finding myself doing more of as a response to it in the conversations I'm having with people, which is just to say, look, a spiritual realm has good and bad. And an enchanted world, you know, like there are things we don't understand. There are good forces and dangerous forces. I believe in God and I believe in the devil. And that, even saying that to you guys feels like rejection therapy for me. Like I have spent my entire life trying to scrub out the weirder parts of what I believe. And I just can't do that anymore. And I refuse to do that. And actually to do that, I'm finding really dissatisfying when I'm looking out at the evil in our world and I'm not able to use the word evil to describe it. I'm finding that really like increasingly annoying. And that's why I found what Rowan Williams said so interesting and fascinating. And so, yes, there are dark elements to these spiritual practices. There are dark forces at play, manipulative forces. And I give subtle warnings in the book where I'm like, if you find yourself being constantly gratified by any spiritual practice, run from the hills. No, run to the hills. Run for the hills, like flee. Because anything that gives you constant and immediate and unconditional gratification is not a good thing. That's actually not the path to flourishing. And so I do it hopefully very subtly, where I just say again and again and again, like, beware of anything that just feels like fast food for your soul, because it's not good. But it's subtle, definitely.
One thing that's interesting to me is that actually I do think people, it's actually sometimes in encounters with a malevolence or something evil that often comes before belief in God, you know, belief in the devil for some people. And I remember, you know, again, going back to that conversation we had with Ashley Landy, where even as someone who, you know, didn't believe in God per se, you know, was talking about, you know, the transcendent or whatever, it was actually an experience of a bad trip and particularly kind of a sort of sensing that there was something negative, you know, a kind of demonic presence essentially in her room that sort of was part of her journey towards sort of starting to come out of that and realizing there's something here. And likewise, Paul Kingsnorth, I think he's spoken of the fact that he came to realize in retrospect that what he was dabbling in with Wicca, you know, to some extent, you know, it's just people larking around in the woods or whatever. But there was also a kind of spiritual side to that he realized he was kind of dabbling in, that he saw there was a you know, a danger in. And I do wonder sometimes whether actually it's kind of there's part of that experience of encountering something like that can suddenly jolt someone into realizing, oh, this is serious, you know, this, you know, and so I don't know, you know, I like you, I would want to warn people against just kind of blithely going off into these things. But sometimes, you know, as we know, God draws straight, you know, straight lines from crooked and so on. That's often people sometimes go through that to kind of realize what they are, that there is a kind of spiritual realm. That's
great. I mean, hearing that again and again and again. The same with Nick Mulvey, right? He was doing all of these spiritual practices and it's like, there's something insidious in so many of them. And it's a big reason why he found Jesus so like life-giving. And you're right, I'm having that conversation so frequently where it's actually not hard. Yeah, right, this is interesting. I haven't really spoken about this or really thought this through to its full conclusion, but I'm finding it not very hard to convince people that there are evil forces in the world right now. That's actually not a tricky thing, which is really interesting. And a lot of it, as you've said, Justin, like people who have experiences with psychedelic drugs, like when the lid is taken off the world, the lid is taken off the world for you. So to convince people that there are insidious forces in the world is actually not a hard task, I'm finding. Actually, this idea of like something a bit more subtle that maybe feels a bit more benign, but is just so filling self and only self, that might actually be the thing that's a bit harder to pinpoint and be like, oh, that, you know, that may not quite be good for you. But yeah, it's very interesting cultural moment in that way.
So I guess leads me on to, I mean, probably the question that I think I'm most interested in me in the book, which was, you in some ways you put alongside each other these two paths. In each chapter, there's basically a kind of we have these deep yearnings, the sacred ache, as you call it, and everybody experiences that. The question is, where do you go with it? Where do you go to kind of itch that scratch that itch? Or where do you go to to kind of to feed that hunger? And I guess on the one side, you've got all these practices of the Reiki and manifesting and spiritual energy and the universe and everything else. On the other side, you have sort of Christian faith. And I guess I wanted to ask, what do you feel is the core difference between those two ways of living, ways of being? If you were to kind of, focus on it, because each chapter looks at a different practice, but is there an underlying theme? And, I suppose I wonder whether it was something to do with, I think you have a phrase at one point, it's not about us.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you'd put that. What's the kind of underlying difference between these two versions of well, if they're not versions of reality, they're more kind of paths, ways in which we satisfy the kind of deepest yearnings of the heart?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think I was toying with the whole way through writing this book. And so I have an epilogue to the book, actually, because it took me a year to write the book. And so it started in Glastonbury 2024 and the epilogue is in Glastonbury 2025 back at the Healing Field. And having spent a year studying these people, looking at them again and thinking, okay, what's the takeaway? I mean, in some ways, Graham, like that precise question, what am I offering that's different? Or what am I advocating for that's different? And it really is summed up in this idea of if our search for something bigger than us, if during that search we somehow shrink it back down to the size of us, we've totally got it wrong. Like it's exactly what you just said. Like if our spiritual aches and longings, and I don't want to listen, like I spend the whole book affirming those. It's not that I want to demonize our neediness. Like Martin Shaw writes of a gimme-ness. And I'm like, there is that. And I don't want to demonize. I have that within me. Yet I think what Christianity teaches you to do is like take that to the God that we believe loves us and made us with that neediness, with that restlessness, and then surrender it there. Then drop our main character syndrome there. So our main character syndrome may lead us sort of to pray or to sort of go to church or plop ourselves in the presence of a God that we're only half sure exists. But I'm so sure that it's one of the first things that drains out of us when we really get to know him. And so I think that would be the main difference is like, as long as we make this about us, we will continue to feel restless. We will continue to feel dissatisfied because it's about something so much bigger than us. And in that, we find so much fulfillment and we get so much filling up, and it's such a dignifying story to be a part of, but we are not the main character of it. And I think, there are tons of differences, heaps of differences. I could talk about community or the fact that, to be a part of a religion has boundaries around it and all of this kind of thing. But I think ultimately it's that we're not the main character in our own spiritual journey. And I'm so convinced that we shouldn't want to be.
Brilliant. Belle, wonderful book. There are about 2 or 3 people that I immediately thought when I was reading it, I want to give this book to so-and-so. And I think it's because you do such a good job actually of actually doing it in that conversational style, which is not at all judgmental. You're really reaching out to people who probably are interested in these different manifestations of spirituality and so on, but wonderfully draw it back to the way that those are ultimately, that ache is ultimately, in your view, answered in Jesus Christ. And so The Sacred Ache is available now by Belle Tindall-Riley, famed presenter of Re-Enchanting. It's subtitled A Christian Perspective on the Search for Divinity in Witchcraft, Crystals and Tarot. It's available, of course, from the link with today's show. And there's a lovely line you use on a few places throughout the book. All that we see is not all that there is. And that, in a way, is a paraphrase of Seen and Unseen, and that is obviously who you write for. That is where Re-Enchanting comes from. It's the organisation that Graham himself was involved in setting up. So it's been a lovely conversation to be able to really get to the heart of what Seen and Unseen is actually all about, what re-enchanting is about, and now we can read it in book form as well. So bless you, Belle. Thank you for this wonderful book, and thank you for the conversation.
Oh, it's been a joy to be on the other side. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Well, I was thinking all three of us have now done a book of our own on re-enchanting. So this brings the tally.
you're right.
You know, it's the perfect trinity of re-enchanting related books. So
Yeah.
We end with the best, of course. Belle, you did a brilliant job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's been wonderful to chat. As ever, you can find more from Re-Enchanting over at seenandunseen.com. You can also find ways to give and support the work that we're doing through Re-Enchanting and Seen and Unseen. All the links are with the show today. But for now, from myself, Justin, from Graham, and from Belle, it's goodbye.